Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. This is the 16th episode of the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Series, and I'm Chris Schott, a partner in the healthcare and life sciences practice in our Washington, D.C. office. I focus my practice on all things market access, and that includes manufacturer compliance related to the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, Medicare Parts B and D, and the 340B Drug Pricing Program, as well as, of course, implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Joining me is Danny Machado, an associate in our Washington, D.C. office.
Hey, Chris. Excited for another fun episode.
We also have a guest on our podcast today, and we're very happy that our partner, Ben Haas, is able to join us. Ben, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Chris and Danny. I'm an FDA partner and global vice chair of Latham's Healthcare and Life Sciences Practice Group. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you, and thank you for joining the podcast today. In each episode, we focus on a specific topic that is relevant to market access drug pricing or the pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors more broadly. And after discussing the substance, we ask the question, which Olympic sport is alike? And we have the list of Olympic sports here to see which most resembles the topic in terms of strategy, complexity, or frankly, level of conflict. So, Danny, to kick us off, what is our topic for today?
Yeah, Chris. Today, hoping to discuss how the Trump administration executive orders and the recent DOGE actions that we're seeing might affect the FDA generally, and more specifically as it relates to novel tobacco and nicotine products and FDA submissions, since we have Ben here with us today.
Yeah, and the tobacco and nicotine products are innovative and can pose challenges under the current FDA approval regime, and yet those challenges and resolutions can be informative for FDA considerations and board generally. So, Ben, maybe we can start with an update about what is happening with the FDA in light of the DOGE actions and the executive orders. What's the latest?
Well, we could talk about this for an hour, given everything that's happened over the past month or so. But let's start with where we are, then unpack an OMB memo that was issued on February 26th. First, the Trump administration has issued a spate of executive orders that will impact FDA operations and perhaps CTP, which is the Center for Tobacco Products. First, Executive Order 14158 establishes DOGE within FDA and requires FDA to identify at least 4 employees that will be part of the DOGE process or DOGE team. Executive Order 14182 directs the agency to rescind 10 regulations for every regulation issued. This is relevant because we're not just talking about regulations in this case. We're talking about a broad set of FDA pronouncements, guidance documents, policy statements, and memoranda. All count as regulations for the purpose of this executive order. Executive Order 14219 requires agencies to, within 60 days of February 19th, identify several different types of regulations that may be struck down eventually. Unconstitutional regulations, regulations that are based on unlawful delegations of legislative power, regulations that are based on anything other than the best reading of the underlying statutory authority or prohibition, and additional regulations that, like that, carry some subjective evaluation. What the executive order does not do is identify who's going to decide that is it best reading of the statute or in the best interest of the broader public, etc. So there's broad discretion here to identify regulations within this broad ambit, whether regulations or guidances, that could be at risk based on this evaluation. This executive order also directs FDA, given the vast number of existing regulations and guidance documents, to liberally exercise its enforcement discretion. And I think, as we'll talk about a bit later, enforcement discretion is a key concept in the tobacco space. Ultimately, OIRA, the agency within OMB that reviews regulations, is then directed to consult with the FDA leadership to identify a regulatory agenda that will rescind or modify the regulations identified as part of this process. And finally, relevant today is Executive Order 14210, which directs agencies to promptly undertake preparations to initiate large-scale reductions in force or RIFs.
Ben, it sure sounds like there is a lot going on with these executive orders. I wonder if we could spend a couple moments hearing your thoughts on the recent OMB memo that you mentioned, and if you could maybe give us some background on what's going on there and what that one's all about.
Well, a very significant memorandum was issued by the OMB, which would be February 26, 2015. Uh, The putative basis for the memorandum is to identify how agencies can best implement that last executive order I mentioned regarding the reduction in force. It's pretty aggressive and exhaustive for that matter. It starts with a pronouncement from OMB Director Russell Vogt that states American people registered their verdict on the bloated, corrupt federal bureaucracy, and tax dollars are being siphoned off to fund unproductive and unnecessary programs that benefit radical interest groups while hurting hardworking American citizens. Here, too, we see another example of a challenge to the federal bureaucracy, so to speak, or in this case, the FDA employees that are out at White Oak. And it goes on from there to provide exhaustive detail of all the steps agencies should take to carry out the RIF, the reduction in force directed by the executive order, downsizing federal offices and workforce positions and eliminating components or departments altogether that are not required by the statute. The upshot is that over the next 2 months, FDA needs to create a significant plan to massively overhaul the agency. And it's ironic because we don't even have FDA leadership. McCreary has gone through the House, but has not been confirmed by the Senate. So this FDA plan is done more or less by temporary employees. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not per these timelines, the plan is already in place before new FDA leadership enters the agency. So let's talk about the specifics. The memo specifically offers guidance on what we refer to as agency reductions in force and reorganization plans, or ARRPs. This phase one requirement is due by March 13th and provides several tools or activities that the agency should engage in. First, continue to comply with the hiring freeze, first outlined in January by the executive order. Second, to eliminate non-statutorily mandated functions through reductions in force. Third, to remove underperforming employees or employees engaged in misconduct and continue to evaluate probationary employees. So while we've already seen a significant firing, so to speak, of probationary employees last month as part of the initial set of reduction in force, we expect to see much more in terms of a reduction at FDA in terms of its activities and operations. So what is actually due to OMB by March 13th, 2025? Not that far away. What the agency needs to provide to OMB is a multi-pronged submission that identifies any statutes that establish the agency or any subcomponent of that agency, employees performing functions not mandated by a statute or regulation who are not typically designated as essential during a lapse in appropriations, whether the agency or any of its subcomponents should be eliminated or consolidated, the specific tools the agency intends to use to achieve efficiencies, including, as to each of the above, the number of full-time equivalent employees, or FTEs, reduced, and potential savings or costs associated with these actions for the next 3 fiscal years, and then several activities related to attrition, people retiring, moving between agencies and the private sector, enhanced policies governing performance and conduct that may lead to attrition, and finally, attrition through the termination or non-renewal or term of limited positions or reemployed employees. Finally, FDA will also need to provide a list by job position of all job positions categorized as essential for purposes of exclusion from a large-scale reduction in force. So this initial document, again, very quick, due by March 13th, 2025, will include several plans to really repurpose and downsize the FDA, all done without FDA leadership in place. Phase two of this process under the OMB memo, due by April 14th of this year, requires agencies to identify all reductions, including FTE positions, term and temporary positions, reemployed employees, real estate footprints, and contracts that will occur in relation to these reductions in force or RIFs. This plan must also include any changes to regulations and agency policies, including changes that must be pursued through notice and comment rulemaking that will lead to the reduction or elimination of agency subcomponents or speed up implementation of the activities identified in the ARP. By September 30th of this year, the full ARRPs are expected to be in place.
Wow. So that sounds like a lot of change. And the initial step here is required on a deadline that's coming up shortly.
Right.
Anyone who's ever worked in a company where there's downsizing, that already brings chaos with it by default. And here it's a very short turnaround time. So that's, it sounds to me very significant. Let me just go and backfill one thing. We've mentioned the term DOGE. That stands for Department of Government Efficiency. In my mind, DOGE is the ruler of the Venetian Republic, but that was a couple hundred years ago. So now DOGE is something very different. So with these drastic measures here, Ben, what are the potential impacts? What do you think is the most significant implication here?
Well, I think without a doubt, we'll see a significant disruption to FDA operations, which is already underway. More or less what we're already seeing at FDA, given what's happened under the Trump administration to date, will continue for this foreseeable future, particularly if we carry forward with a significant reduction in force. So, for instance, the initial round of firing, so to speak, at FDA implicated not only line employees, but many folks who have specialized scientific expertise. And more to the point, many employees who are funded by user fees. So firing these folks didn't lead to any savings by the taxpayer, but rather sort of remove folks that were important to very novel technologies. I think we've all heard about medical devices and those reviewers that received terminations and have since been rehired. Frankly, over the next couple of months, companies with applications in the queue before FDA may not know whom to speak with, whether that person will even be employed in 6 weeks, who's doing what, simply because offices may be consolidated, offices may be closed down, and so on. So when we come down to brass tacks, talking about lengthier pre-market reviews for applications, whether we're drugs, devices, tobacco products, which we'll speak a bit about, less enforcement at the back end, including products that may be harmful to the broader public, and more litigation. You marry this to the overturning of the Chevron doctrine last year in the Supreme Court. The ground is fertile for folks to challenge rules where they feel that FDA has got out over its skis with respect to the congressional mandate and Constitution.
Yeah, and you mentioned the tobacco and nicotine products. So I know that you focus a lot of your practice on those issues and related FDA submissions. So Ben, just specifically for that industry, what do you think are some potential impacts here?
It's a very immature process at FDA that is likely to only slow down more. And by that, I mean companies under statute need to obtain from FDA a marketing granted order, an authorization to continue marketing their products. Whether we're talking about, and here I'm specifically referring to novel products like modern oral products, electronic cigarettes, your non combusted products. These are subject to applications that we refer to as PMTAs or pre-market tobacco product applications, which we could have a whole nother podcast about how that process was established. But all that aside, FDA currently has thousands of PMTAs under review by the agency while these same products are on the market in the United States. FDA today has granted only a handful of PMTAs. So if we take a step back, there are only a few products and product lines that have been proactively authorized by the FDA. Everything else is putatively illegal and therefore at risk of enforcement by the agency. There are also several other policy initiatives that late in the Biden administration, FDA attempted to carry forward. This would be a proposed rule reducing the nicotine content in cigarettes to a low level that's considered non-addictive, manufacturing practices for tobacco product manufacturers that are in process, banning flavors and menthol in combusted tobacco products. It seems to me that based on the DOGE initiative, those rulemakings and sort of policy efforts will be shelved or altogether thrown out.
And Ben, what do we mean when we say enforcement discretion in this particular context?
As I indicated earlier, under the so-called deeming regulation, which folks who operate in the tobacco space would know well, FDA was by statute authorized to extend its jurisdiction against new products, novel products, in a so-called deeming regulation. So back in 2016, FDA extended its reach to capture electronic cigarettes, modern oral products, and sort of novel tobacco products more generally, anything made or derived from tobacco. Later, they obtained jurisdiction over products that contain synthetic nicotine. The statute requires, as I noted, any applicant who seeks to continue marketing these products to obtain a authorization from FDA. To date, FDA has only issued a few authorizations. So the vast number of tobacco products currently on the market, or that you see are 7-Eleven, e-cigarettes, modern oral products, are not legal insofar as they lack an FDA authorization. So they're marketed pursuant to what we call enforcement discretion from the agency, a policy under which FDA opts not to enforce the requirements of the Act if the conditions established in that enforcement discretion policy are met. Well, what do we mean here? Well, kids aren't using the product's not hurting people. You don't market it in like a box that has like bubblegum candy or exotic flavorings, etc. Sort of the jewel type scenario from 8 years ago that led to a significant uptick in teen use of tobacco products. As long as you sort of avoid that, FDA is taking a hands off approach. All that being said, these products are subject to enforcement at any time. So it'll be interesting to see whether FDA adjusts its enforcement discretion policies as we move forward.
So, I mean, that sounds like we definitely need to watch this space, and it's no different in other areas. Obviously, Danny and I focus a lot on CMS changes, and there's layoffs there too and activity. So it's just very interesting, Ben, to hear how this is impacting FDA, which goes right to the heart of approving the products that we rely on in many different ways. So it's fascinating to hear those latest developments. And I think that really takes us to the question we had posed at the very beginning when we started discussing the topic. Which Olympic sport is it like? And Ben, we'll go to you first. What did you pick?
I'm going to go one better and give you a specific year that I have in mind. When I thought about this earlier, what immediately came to mind is being a kid and watching Eddie the Eagle do the ski jump, right? Somebody who, and I'm equating this perhaps to some DOGE employees, somebody who really doesn't have a technical background, maybe young, maybe not well trained, but otherwise rises to the very peak of the profession, like the Olympics, goes down a giant ski jump, goes up in the air. There's a huge group of people rooting for a crash. That's why they're watching. They want to see him wipe out. There are other folks who want to see the underdog stick the landing. And then there are folks that just want a good Olympics and hope that he lands and gets a good score and sort of achieves that underdog sort of story. So for me, it's Eddie the Eagle being 100 feet in the air, waiting for him to land as part of the ski jump. That's my analogy.
That's excellent. Danny, what do you think?
Well, Chris, Ben's explanation of, the swift personnel changes and potential policy shifts at the FDA just made me think of badminton, where I think players just need to kind of react really fast reflexes with the little shuttlecocks are flying at them, and they basically have to make these split-second decisions, constantly kind of adjust their strategy based on what's coming from the other side. Similar to how regulated companies here are going to need to quickly pivot, right, their compliance approaches as leadership chains just kind of ripple through federal agencies like FDA or CMS in our case. Chris, what did you choose?
Okay, well, I'm going to return to the theme of mortal danger that Ben has introduced, and also to winter sports. I'm going to pick bobsleigh, where three people jump into this flimsy fiberglass contraption and then shoot down the icy half pipe. And it sounds like that's exactly the kind of ride we're embarking on, except that we don't know what the course actually looks like. And if you are in that position where you have to jump on a ride like that, most important thing is pick your buddies who are going to jump in the sleigh with you. So I would say with these challenges that we're seeing unfold, pick good advisors, pick supporters inside your organizations to be ready with curves and wrinkles so that we don't crash our flimsy fiberglass sleigh and get ejected out of the half pipe, and we have to somehow finish the run even in this difficult situation. I think that wraps up our discussion for today. Danny, where are we going for the after party?
Well, I don't know about you two, but I'm personally craving some good Mexican food. And Oyamel came to mind. It's a quick walk from our office, and it's surprisingly nice outside today. So I would love to go there, and I bet we can get some nice spicy guac as well.
Sounds excellent. I think you were thinking of badminton because it is such a nice day. You want to be outside.
That's exactly right.
It makes sense. But that sounds great. Can't wait to go. And thank you for joining the podcast.
Chris, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak on this topic.
Thanks to Ben for joining us today and sharing insights on recent developments affecting the FDA generally and impacts on the tobacco and nicotine industry more specifically. And thanks to Danny for being a moderator. And thank you to our listeners for checking out the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Series, which is part of our Connected with Latham podcast. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you have questions or would like additional information, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.